what does dormancy mean? I mean, we're going to break it down right now.
Yeah. So, I mean, when they go dormant, they get a frost on them. And so all their leaves, because most perennials have thinner leaves and they're a little bit tender. So that's the biggest difference between an evergreen has a much thicker leaf where perennials have a thinner leaf. And when the frost hits it, it just shrivels it up and then it'll die down to the ground. Some perennials die all the way down to the ground, some don't. But it's just a good time for them to rest and store up energy for next season to bloom a lot.
So what are the roots doing while the leaves shrivel up and go away?
They're actually here in Georgia, since the ground doesn't freeze, they'll have root growth all winter. So now is actually a great time to get stuff in the ground because you're going to get all that root growth all winter. It's not a ton, but it's a little bit. So I personally like getting stuff planted before they wake up in the spring, because when they wake up in the spring and get that big push of energy, they also grow roots. So you want them in the ground and not in that pot. So it pushes all those roots out in the pot. You want it to push out into the soil, and then it'll be more established and you won't have to water as much.
Devin, I've always heard that you're not supposed to fertilize this time of year for perennials and things like that, but you're saying that roots are still growing. So would you agree?
Yeah, you definitely don't want to fertilize this time of year because you just want those roots to grow. You don't want to encourage any new like green growth up top. If you use like something heavy in nitrogen, that's going to encourage the tops to grow. Where you want, I mean, you don't really need to fertilize. It's not going to take up much nutrients. It's just kind of slowly growing and rooting in. So
I think like especially in the South that is true. Like remember last year when we had this extreme freeze at Christmas? The freeze wasn't the problem. It was the biggest problem that we had 50 degrees the day before. And like a lot of my customers lost like the most basic things, like just because they fertilized. Like anybody who fertilized, it just like the tissue was way too soft, nothing was hardened up. And also the fertilizer itself can change because the temperature is not right. So like you can get more salts in the soil that hurt the plant because the soil temperature wasn't right for the fertilizer to actually be active.
How do I protect from, like, we had a 50-year freeze. Don't quote me on 50-year. It was a bad freeze last January. What is the ways I'm going to protect my perennials and other shrubs, other materials, my Daphne and my mountain laurel from a really hard freeze? Can I use, my question I get a lot from my clients, can I use worm castings as a way to protect root growth? Worm castings and other soil amendments.
Yeah, I mean, it would work as a layer. I mean, it would be similar to mulch, but I prefer mulch because it'll warm up a little bit more.
You will have such a bad freeze. So I'm like a big proponent of, if I have one bad freeze, I'll take all my blankets and all my old towels and just throw it over stuff that I would be really sad about. And if it's in a container, it comes inside. But I really, unless I planted something that's like marginally hardy in wherever I live, I don't do much extra. But I swear, for just stuff that you have laying in around your house and it's just 1, 2, 3 nights and you have a little ghost garden.
Yeah.
You should have seen my yard last Christmas because it got down to 19 in Tallahassee.
Oh, you showed me the picture. We should blend that in for.
Oh my gosh, I can send. I have pictures. My yard looked like a giant morgue. I have giant pieces of frost cloth and I had everything covered. Had to move all the citrus in the garage. It was terrible. And then I ended up losing a bunch of stuff, but it was like tropical stuff like hibiscus.
Yeah. The freeze from last year made me realize how many things I had planted that were marginally hardy too. Like I didn't realize gardenias were marginally hardy, and the tea olives they didn't die, but they're still, trying to make a recovery. And I had a dwarf variegated pittosporum. They all 1, 2, 3. Instant death.
But I still believe that like sometimes it's not even just the hardiness. Like last year was bad because it was so warm the days before. Stuff was actively growing. And I oftentimes think you don't have to be worried in November, December about hard freezes. When it gets really tricky is in March. February, March, you have stuff actively growing. The plant tissue is super soft. And then like even a slight freeze can really hurt your plants. So like hostas are definitely one. Like once you see those little, we call them horns,
Nice.
little Devin
Yes.
horns, that is, you really, really want to cover them. If you freeze them off, hostas tend to not really regrow nicely leaves. Like you'll see it the rest of your year. So I definitely feel like with some stuff, I'm like, if it burns back my nepeta a little bit more once again and it just delays blooming, whatever. But like, if it actually will make a difference in your whole year's worth of, what this plant looks like, yeah, just take a blanket, throw it over, make a little ghost garden.
One thing
Okay.
that I did when it got cold that actually worked out really good this year, like like you're talking about the hostas that were emerging, even though I don't have hostas because I can't grow hostas in 8B, but all my
Maybe
calicaceas and everything were coming up. But I used old nursery pots. They were
Oh,
great.
yeah.
I was like, this is the greatest. Because I had run out of sheets and everything, and I was like, I still need to cover more stuff. And I was like, oh, I got a bunch of 10 and 15 gallon buckets over here, so I just had buckets all over everything that
Yeah.
was waking up. So
I
I
did
love
that
the bucket.
too. I did
yeah,
that earlier, like when it was still warm and sunny, so that I felt like it got some
yeah,
radiant heat
trap
there.
seat.
And then I was like, okay, they were okay.